Okay, cool. So the first of the two articles that we were reading was titled "In New Study Points to Protein as an Agent of Artherosclerosis. Is this true?" And that was reviewed by Alan Aragon himself. So the actual study that he looked at was titled "Identification of Leucine-Mediated Threshold Effect Governing Macrophage mTOR Signaling in Cardiovascular Risk." That's a mouthful. He did start off with what is atherosclerosis. To begin with, most people are familiar with what it is. So basically arterial plaque development, which is what we don't want. We want our arteries to be nice and free so that blood can flow freely. Otherwise, if we have too much arterial plaque, it can lead to a heart attack, etc. So clearly we do not want that. So this study and several news headlines claimed that protein is partially responsible for our atherosclerosis, or could potentially be partially responsible for atherosclerosis. But he then pointed out, so he as an Alan, that first of all, the details of this was threefold. So there were two rodent in vitro and in vivo, so meaning in a pastry dish or in the actual rodents, and one human in vitro component of the study. The in vitro component in the rodents reported that a dose-response effect of protein on the reduction of autophagy, or reported a dose-response effect of protein on the reduction of autophagy and macrophages. So meaning less dead white blood cells were cleared out, the more protein the rodents consumed. And of course, we do want dead blood cells, or any kind of dead cell, to be cleared out. So that clearing out is referred to as autophagy. You might have heard the term thrown around in terms of fasting and so on, which was supposed to, or is supposed to, in part, at least if it's very prolonged fasting, enhance autophagy. But anyway, so more unwanted dead white blood cells in the bloodstream could lead to plaque development. It was postulated in those articles. The in vivo, so within the actual rodents component, compared a protein consumption of 7, 21, or 42% in the rodent's diet, and found more arterial plaque development in the 42% group. The two in vitro human studies, so they literally just treated the white blood cells in a petri dish. And the first one of them examined effects of liquid foods, so about 450 calories, with 10% versus 50% from protein. And the higher percentage showed greater monocyte mTOR activation, which is not surprising because in general, more protein we kind of associate with more mTOR activation, so more muscle protein synthesis in the human case. The concern was that the monocytes have the potential to manifest into atherosclerosis, sclerotic plaque macrophages. In the other study, they compared with solid food, so 500 calories with either 15 or 22% from protein. They observed a dose-response relationship, once again, between protein intake and autophagy reduction in macrophages. But I mean, like 15 versus 22, I personally find that a little weird study setup, because like that's not a very big difference. But anyway, Alan's very, very big point here simply being rodents are not humans. And while they are often useful for assessing certain things, or for transferring particular research over to humans, there are certain aspects where rodents are not the best comparison. And specifically when it comes to protein and amino acid metabolism, there are huge differences. So rodents are really not the best comparisons here. He says the differences in protein and amino acid metabolism are that humans and rats have vastly different distributions of BCAA aminotransferase, which is an enzyme that catalyzes the first step of the breakdown of BCAAs into their respective AKA or BCKA alpha keto acids. The oxidation of BCAA in humans occurs primarily in the skeletal muscle, while the catabolism of the other essential amino acids in rodents occurs in the liver, which is highly disparate, and rodents have much greater oxidative capacity than humans. Furthermore, he also says that there are huge differences in carb and fat metabolism. So things like de novo lipogenesis, so DNL, which is the conversion from carbohydrates to fatty acids for storage as triglycerides, is 60 to 70% triglycerides in rodents and only less than 5% triglycerides in humans under longer-term isocaloric, highly carbohydrate feeding conditions. So also he notes that liver X receptors have markedly different signaling activity and response to stimuli in rats versus humans, which is really important to note because they are key regulators of genes that are involved in glucose and lipid homeostasis. Another difference is that beta cells differ in their production of key enzymes involved in glucose signaling and oxidation. So basically, just to sum that up, an example of the vast difference in metabolism between rodents and humans is when they do keto studies on or zero carb protocols on rats, where they really gain a huge amount of body fat, and we can see huge metabolic disruptions in rodents. They do not do well at all on zero or no carb protocols. Whereas we know that, of course, I mean, given calories, the right calories, humans do just fine without carbs in the sense of how our metabolism continues to function. And so lastly, the vast majority of high versus low protein studies in humans thus far show that high protein intake is not associated with an increased risk of stroke, myocardial infarction, and cardiovascular death. Meta-analyses even show superior benefits and interventions related to heart health in regards to weight loss, fat loss, and blood pressure reduction, lipid profile, and insulin levels. Alan Aragon also urges us to consider that food sources need to be taken into consideration when we're talking about protein anyways, but also, of course, fats, carbs, etc., because highly processed sausage is not necessarily the same as a nice piece of steak or otherwise. But yeah, I picked this reasonably short article because I just think it's so easy for certain things to get blown out of proportion in the media, by the media, and of course they jump onto something like that where we have a catchy title and not like some, most people reading this, they're going to be like, oh no, protein is gonna, or it shows very easily that it leads to atherosclerosis. Even though, again, like rodents, humans, very different, but you don't necessarily think that, or you don't think, okay, why can't you extract that data here? But then in other studies, someone might say like, oh no, okay, of course, clearly it worked in rodents, so it also is transferable to humans. So I understand the confusion, but I do like that there are people like Alan Aragon out there who just really point out, hey, we need to think a little bit for ourselves or pause before we jump onto anything like that, especially if it's really hyped by newspapers, etc. So yeah, what were your guys' thoughts on this first portion?
I agree with what you said about like the media blowing things out of proportion. It reminded me of the analogy where, and nobody jump all over me, I'm not trying to promote like drinking Diet Coke, but I enjoy Diet Coke. And then somebody told me one time, you clean toilet bowls with that. I was like, well, my body, it does not operate or process the same way as a toilet bowl. Like, so that's what it reminded me of. I thought this was easy to follow. I mean, I thought without, there wasn't a lot of terms that I had to look up or anything like that. So I always appreciate that.
Yeah, no, I'm absolutely the same. I think he digested it just enough for us. Of course, there were a few words here and there still nonetheless when it came to the protein metabolism, but in general, I thought so also. So thank you for that input. What about the other ladies? Anybody? Any thoughts? Good, bad? Didn't care for it? Thought it was boring, thought it was interesting.
I have a hard time understanding like why they do studies like this when we know there's no transferability to humans. So maybe now we know that rats shouldn't have a high protein diet. I didn't know that. It's just kind of weird that it exists when it doesn't really offer any actionable outcomes.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, especially because there are so many like interesting study designs that I could think of where I'm like, that would be so cool to do. And now, yeah, no, they will do something like this instead. But yeah,
Yeah, to generate headlines, perhaps.
yeah, that's true.
Correct.
Joyce or Laura, any thoughts? No? Okay, cool. All right, we will move on then. Right, so the second part of the research review, or one of the other articles we wanted to read, was titled Chronic Pain, What is it and how should we approach it? This was written by Michael Edgar. So in general, when it comes to chronic pain, of course, there are several theories out there, but he just basically wanted to discuss a few of them. The first one was that pain is an unpleasant experience felt somewhere in the body, which urges us to protect that bodily location, i.e., it is a protective mechanism. Others include movement, immune, cognitive, and endocrine and autonomic function. According to this theory, pain is the only protective mechanism we are necessarily aware of and compels us to do something in reaction to it. The second theory is that there is a scale of quote unquote danger in me, and then on the other side, safety in me. And pain will be perceived if there is more credible evidence of danger in me. The third is that the brain is a neural network that produces both a perception of pain and a matching motor command, like bracing and guarding. He also, or that in his equation means that kinesiophobia and chronic pain have a bidirectional cycle, and he basically explained that as pain has a matching behavioral response and in accord a movement-based outcome. So for example, people in pain tend to modify their movements, but also people who expect to be in pain, as well as decreased movement availability. So kinesiophobia is essentially the excessive and irrational fear of physical movement. It can also relate to the idea of catastrophic thoughts and fear avoidance belief patterns. That means we didn't simply see our perceptions as a response to how our body feels, but that it is a two-way street where both affect one another. Mike Edgar then kind of goes on about Tampa scale for kinesiophobia. I don't even want to discuss that. I don't necessarily think that that's important for us. But there was an interesting quote. We need to realize that pain is not purely structural damage, but also relates in many regards to one's perception of their context and circumstances. So when does acute pain become chronic pain? In the acute stage of pain, there tends to be a stimulus which is provoked each time we perform a movement that relates to these structures. In turn, we perceive the pain signals, which makes us terminate the movement, reinforcing our decision to avoid pain. Over time, we begin to preemptively perceive this pain response before performing the movement, which causes us to further validify this decision as pain was not experienced. The issue with this, though, is that while tissues have healed and structural integrity is present, we still perform these guarding responses, and our conformatory signals continue to develop despite the initial injury being removed. So here are his 3 steps of how we should break the cycle. The biopsychosocial model of care. Initially, or essentially, that means that disease is attributed to the intricate blend of biological, psychological, and social factors. So the first one would be that communication always has to come first. We need to educate the individual on the mechanism of pain to move away from a subconscious hyperfocus towards pain. The second one would be movement and exercise to find ways to simply get the individual moving more, and then gradual exposure to activity and pain-provoking behaviors. So again, communicating our methods and our whys. And then the third one, to be aware of the lack of the social network someone might have, or the support network someone does have, or negative affirmations that they might be using. So all in all, he summarizes that we should not stigmatize or stereotype, and to be open and adaptable, and to mostly ask questions. I loved that last part here because it's very practical, but I want to talk about it even more with more practical examples with you guys, because I know that we have all, or I don't know about you, Annie, but I know about the others, that we've all gone through this before ourselves. We've all been injured to an extent, most of us pertaining to our back, Allison at the moment with her knee, but we all know what that's like when you've had an injury. Let's just say it's a bulged disc or whatever, you bend forward and suddenly it's like, oh, you don't want to move anymore. And okay, so then you kind of move awkwardly. So that's sort of the first part that he's describing. We're like avoiding certain movements which might re-aggravate it, etc. And then we fully, or not fully, but we kind of like almost ease into like those, what do you want to call it? Those avoidance movements. So I see that, or have seen that very clearly over the last few weeks with my grandma. My grandma broke one of the vertebrae in her back, and she always used to be like super, super active, and now she basically, she's never been really injured, and she has also never been taught by a physiotherapist or a proper doctor how to make sure that you're not compensating poorly for this. And so she's sitting there like that, because in any other posture, or like literally like really lopsided. And so of course, naturally now after a few weeks, her neck has started to hurt. She's now having like hip issues because she's just sitting there like that. Of course, she's moving less all in all because she's afraid of that pain coming on again. And so even if I mean, in the case of a broken vertebrae, it's pretty extreme, but let's just say in the case of this healing on its own after a while, which was for many of us in many injuries probably the case, we just needed to give it time or stop training for a little bit or things like that. Still, I vividly also remember the fear of doing a particular movement again. And it doesn't even have to be something like you do a deadlift and suddenly your disc bulges and you're for the rest of your life afraid of doing a deadlift, but it's just generally a movement. So for me, like with the sciatica, for instance, there was like particular, I think it was actually sumo squats in the beginning when I would always feel like I would re-aggravate it for a couple of days later. And so like it took me a long time to mentally be like, no, Lisa, you're fully healed up. As long as you're like focusing on the quality of the movement, you can actually do that. But just that mental hurdle, I totally get it. And I mean, we're so like aware of our bodies, aware of all of this, and then so for people that don't necessarily think about all these things, they just go about what their body tells them, and their body and their mind in this case specifically say like, no, avoid this movement, rather sit lopsided for the rest of your life than potentially go through this pain again. So yeah, that was a long monologue. First of all, what are your guys' thoughts on the paper? And second of all, if someone wants to share some personal pain experiences or injury experiences, of course, I would love to hear those also.
I was interested that the first paragraph on page 15, when he referred to chronic pain, his, at least how I interpreted, he referred to chronic pain was different than what I consider chronic pain. Chronic pain to me is like, an injury that, or not necessarily an injury, but, pain that's ongoing and ongoing and ongoing. And I think he meant that in his, in his article, but I took it as a different way. Like I say like an aging is chronic pain to me. So I had that in my mind. And as I was reading along, I really had to like recenter. Okay, this is what he means by chronic pain.
Yeah, no, you're right. Like at first, even when I read the headline, I also thought more in the sense of like, yeah, disc degeneration or whatever. And someone like every day they wake up and they're in pain, and like everything that they're doing, they're in pain and so on. So yeah, it's interesting that he had a little bit of a different definition of that. I mean, Joyce, perhaps you want to share a little bit about your current pain, or like you've had many injuries and also surgery on your back and so on. Did you ever feel yourself like really avoiding a movement, or like going into like, especially if it's with a neck, we're probably like tense and just trying to protect that area naturally. Do you have anything you want to share on that front?
I mean, with my neck and stuff, I just was at the time that all that happened, I just had so much pain. I couldn't focus on anything. It was just like he had to give me something to help me through the pain, to relieve all the inflammation in there till my surgery came up. But then, I think protected it after everything was said and done.
Mm-hmm.
After my surgery, so I wouldn't go through that again, because I don't want to go through that again. It was horrible. But now I'm dealing with my back. My whole spine basically just hurts all the time. Has been for years, but I'm one of those who's just going to keep going and pushing until it knocks me off my feet. That's just how I am. So, but anyway, and then, I did go to the doctor yesterday or Monday, I think it was, and he's like, no heavy lifting, you don't need to do this, you don't need to do that, but you don't need surgery either. So, which was good. But I wouldn't refer this doctor to anybody, just to make that kind of short and sweet. He just very.
But what I'm interested in also, just in regards to that recovery from the surgery way back, did you notice like within you a fear of, obviously at first putting the barbell back on your back, or like just anything where you were like, oh, this could potentially hurt, or that you were going into this sort of different posture even just to protect yourself?
Yeah, I would. Yes, absolutely. Yes, I was afraid of that. I was afraid that if I put any type of weight on my neck, that it would do something, mess something up, or cause a disc to, be gone or whatever, but even though, and that's been 7 years, I still watch it. I'm still a little leery of it, and I still watch and not put heavy on my back and stuff. It bugs me because I want to do it, but I know it's not really worth the consequences if something happens, which they said eventually will, but I just am just trying to be on the safe side of that. So I'm always going to be like that. It's just, I think that's just human nature for most people. So, and the older you get, the harder it is as well. So,
Precisely. But yeah, I think the good thing is that you're like aware of it. And so also that if you noticed to protect your neck, you would suddenly start walking around like that. Okay, that's probably not good either. I need to like straighten up, because I logically know there is nothing there anymore.
Yeah, that's just like, with my back and stuff. I try to sit up straight. I try not to slump and have a bad posture, because that's just making it worse. So I'm trying to, I have actually caught myself, more so doing that. So I'm being more aware of that. So just so I don't make it worse. So, but.
I think there's a difference between compensating for pain that we're experiencing, like for fear of re-injuring something, knowing I can't go out and run on my injured knee because it can make things worse, versus the fear of the pain rather than actual injury. Potentially there could be pain, but no damage occurring. And I think it kind of reminded me of, I don't know if I can articulate this very well, but it kind of reminded me of when I was teaching yoga. one of the things that we talked about a lot was the defaults that we all have in our yoga practice in this instance, but how you do anything is how you do everything, right? Like what we do on our yoga mat, we tend to have the same behaviors and ways of doing things out off of the yoga mat. So for example, the instructor might say, go into warrior one pose. And so we go into that pose in the way that we always, oh, I know what this feels like in my body. And we go to our default. We have these defaults in everything that we do. And we never question that. We never notice, oh, maybe I could rotate my foot a little bit this way, or, we never consider fine tuning those things because that's how we do this thing. And when we start avoiding movements in life, if we're experiencing pain, then sometimes those things become our new defaults. And it's really hard to like be aware of that in the moment to disrupt that programming of going into your default and, not even thinking about it. So I think there's a little bit of like cognitive behavioral therapy kind of stuff in that space that can help us make, even practicing yoga, not in a way that's like threatening to injure us again, but to kind of identify the mindfulness of those moments and identify the defaults that maybe we have and choosing different movements or different depths of movements or, in the context of yoga or not.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think especially also like that's one of the beauties of, or one of the benefits of having like a physiotherapist or any kind of coach with you, especially after an injury for a while, so that they can point that out and be like, oh, okay. Oftentimes I think one of the best personal trainers, they will assess you or look at you and be like, did you have an injury on your left ankle a few years ago? And you're like, how did you know that? Well, because you're mostly pushing with your right side, you're hardly using your left side. And you're like, oh, I didn't even know that. So like, as you say, we all do that, whether it's from a big injury or not, or even just from being dominant on the one hand or the other or so. But yeah, like regularly regaining that awareness of certain things or just checking ourselves. And of course, these automatic mechanisms, they are so helpful because if we had to think about every single little thing or movement all the time, we would never get anywhere. I don't know if you guys have ever like literally, like I don't know why, but sometimes when you think about how you walk or how you run, it suddenly feels super strange because you're like, I don't even know how to do that. And you start falling or whatever, because you suddenly start analyzing what you're doing and something that's automatic normally. I think it's the strangest sensation. So it does make sense that we have all these automatic things, but still.
Lisa, I think you brought up a really good point about having a good physio or a coach to guide you through and see what areas of your body you were overcompensating for, because I injured my right arm a couple years ago. Like I tore the tendon there, and I specifically went to look for a doctor who wouldn't tell me, oh, don't work out anymore. And luckily I found my doctor now who does CrossFit. He's also a CFL2 instructor for CrossFit. And, yeah, so like through him, he was able to say, hey, I know the movements that you're doing and this is what you're doing. So here's how we can correct it. And honestly, finding that doctor and pushing me through really helped with the fear that I also had after, because I didn't want to re-injure that. That was a miserable year recovering. So finding that right practitioner to help you get through the fear and to recorrect your movements is really important.
Yeah, and someone who doesn't just say like, oh, you should stop for 6 months now, because also we know by now that for most injuries, actual inactivity and like even now when you break your clavicle or whatever, they don't say anymore, or for the next 3 months, don't move your arm at all. Afterwards, you're gonna have like frozen shoulder and whatnot. Nowadays, we know that the sooner you can get movement and blood and everything back into there, of course, in the right way, the better. But at old school doctor or physio or whatever is probably might still tell you, no, you gotta rest it up, you can't do anything, and then you mentally go crazy on top of that, and then it worse turns to even worse. But Allison, I was gonna ask you anyway, because I don't think we actually talked properly after your, I know you haven't done a run, but you went on a reasonably bigger hike. not too long ago, and that was the first one since your doctor basically said, no, you should, or you can do that again. How was it for your knee?
So it was a little bit sore afterwards, but it was better than it was before I rested it. So before I stopped going for walks or hikes or runs or any of that stuff, it was really, really sore because I also had like a strain or a sprain in my MCL. And I think that the resting actually healed that piece of it. And now there's just soreness and pain from the meniscus tear. So it was a little bit sore afterwards, but not terrible, but it was there. Yeah.
It wasn't like it didn't make you want to go on a walk right away again the next day or even the next weekend, I guess. Maybe is that how you would say it?
It wasn't like a lasting soreness, so I think I took some Advil, some ibuprofen afterwards. I'm trying to remember, just a little bit, like one capsule. And then the next day when I was on my trip to Mammoth, we went hiking again. I think we went on 3 hikes. So it wasn't anything that was like, oh, I have to stop what I'm doing. Because the doctor assured me like I'm not going to re-injure it or make it, well, not re-injure, but make it worse. I'm still injured. So it was kind of like, well, it only kind of hurts. It's fine. I have a fairly high pain tolerance. I'm just going to do the thing because I want to do the thing.
Yeah. But you didn't specifically notice like you mostly just limping on the left side rather than the right. You were trying to like still kind of evenly distribute it more or less.
Yeah, I don't feel like I had a ton, like most of the hike, I felt pretty good. I didn't have any pain. And then when we started, it was like mostly uphill. And then when we started going downhill is when I started to feel it more. And so it's less about not putting weight on that foot and more about like not twisting my foot. So I guess I would say the way that I'm stepping over rocks and stepping down or whatever, I'm kind of pivoting my body in a way that I don't have to twist that knee. So there is probably some movement compensation in that way.
Okay, yeah, but
Yeah.
understandable, I guess.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. Well, thank you for everyone's input and for your time today. I will be sending out next week's article soon. And yeah, if you have any articles that you come across or so, then let me know also. I was going to say, lastly, I have one, and I have a podcast recommendation. Some of you might already have listened to it. It's performed by Andy Galpin, and he did an episode on how to read blood work. Really, really very much in depth. I highly recommend reading or listening to it and maybe even taking some notes. Cool. Well, I hope you all have a nice rest of your day, and I'll see you soon.
You
Bye
too.
bye.
Thank you.
Bye.